Okay, welcome back. This is part two of our lecture on contemporary art. And when we last left off, we were doing this kind of fun little game post, talking about Romanticism, modernism, and postmodernism, kind of in comparison to each other as influences on contemporary culture and contemporary art. So here are all some examples of very postmodern artwork where it's not just from the postmodern period, although you can maybe make the case that Sol LeWitt's work is a little bit earlier than that, but that also very strongly reflects kind of postmodern aesthetics. And I think one of the things I want to get at in terms of with this lecture is the idea that understanding aesthetic differences, like we can talk about the ideas. Like in the last discussion, people asked me to write up kind of some pretty thorough um, explanations of like the aesthetic ideas of Romanticism. But I think fundamentally, you have to learn it by experience, right? To really be able to understand aesthetics, like the aesthetic difference between general romantic art compared to modernist art, you have to really just look at a lot of it and understand it experientially as much as you are understanding it by, because it's not the sort of thing where we can have a set line and say if it has this characteristic, it is absolutely not this. I mean, after all, to a certain degree, there's a lot about this piece that you could say is very formalist and therefore reflects very modernist ideas. But nonetheless, you walk into a room with a pyramid of toilet paper and you are certain that you're looking at very postmodern contemporary art. Here's Matthew Barney. We'll be talking a little bit more about Matthew Barney later in the lecture. So here's my another set. This time comic book heroes in comic book, not in cartoons. And yes, I think that Wolverine is very romantic, both as kind of this dark, suffering anti-hero. Captain America is kind of like Superman is, and especially this Jack Kirby version of Captain America is kind of like the superhero hero, right? The hero who represents superheroism. And Deadpool, of course, a comic book character who thinks he is a comic book character, is just about the most postmodern version of a comic book hero that you could get. Here's So for the rest, these are all just kind of very pop culture kind of comparisons. And so we've got obviously these are all video games, Romanticism, modernism, and postmodernism. One of the reasons why I use so many examples, like I said, this lecture is for our junior seminar, is that I feel like some of the students in the class might never play, might not be gamers, might not play games, um, but at least one of the connections will kind of make a connection, and they'll get it, and they'll be like, "Oh, I think I understand." These are all movies based off of comic books, so that was the category I was trying to use. Um, there are so many movies with Johnny Depp in them; it's pretty amazing. Um, and these are all actually based off of very alternative comic books. Um, Obviously, Scott Pilgrim versus the World is extremely postmodern. And you can make the case that a comic book and then the movie based off of it, Ghost World, is kind of postmodern, but there's a lot about it, especially the movie, that's quite modernist. Romanticism, yeah. We had a great debate in my family as to what were the right ones to use for this. A lot of the debate was about the modernist one. Should it be Naruto, or should we go right back to the basics and start with Pokemon? But I feel like Pokemon is too much of a particular thing, whereas Naruto is like the epitome of animes, right? It is the anime, and that aspect of it makes it very kind of essentialist, right? One Punch Man is obviously very postmodern. All right, these are movies by Wes Anderson. And I think, like, and this is all relative, like a movie like The Royal Tenenbaums, in anybody else's body of work would probably be considered their most postmodern movie, but in the context of Wes Anderson, since it is the most essentially Wes Anderson of movies, it's like the blueprint for all other Wes Anderson movies. It has a feeling of being his most modernist. And this is the last slide where I leave some some blanks for you to kind of think about what you would fill in. And to a certain degree, you could do this for all of these comparisons. In this case, the category is children's TV shows hosted by um, you know real live people, but with cartoon and other kind of elements added to it. Okay, so that's the end of that part. Now we're just going to get through the rest of the lecture is really just a list of all these artists that the students in the junior seminar had to know for their final test. And I kind of retweaked their order so they go more chronologically. So at the first set, some of these are not actually contemporary or postmodern artists. Someone like Marcel Duchamp is pre-postmodern, but many people view him as being like, in some ways, the first postmodernist, because he was doing postmodern or creating postmodern ideas long before postmodernism existed, long before anyone was writing any kind of postmodern theory. Marcel Duchamp was practicing it. And probably fundamentally the way that his artwork is postmodern is just raising the question of what is and what is not art, and making that kind of like the fundamental point of art is an extremely postmodern kind of activity. So here we have again Piero Manzoni, who we saw before, John Baldessari, who talked about a little bit in the last lecture. And he did go back to actually making imagery, by the way. It wasn't purely only making conceptual art after he gave up painting. He returned to imagery where he combined photography with various forms of printmaking and some amount of hand-painted, hand-manipulated with it. But for a while, his artwork was completely, purely conceptual. Philip Guston. So these are all artists that I think kind of like set the tone. I should have actually added Bruce Nauman into this group, but he wasn't there in the original set. These are all the artists I think kind of set the tone for where postmodernism and contemporary art went. Philip Guston, amazingly enough, in that he was of an older generation, but in this final body of work that he made, he really kind of, more than just about anyone, set the tone of where painting for the next 30 years, from the 1970s, where painting was going to go for the next 30 or 40 years. Probably no one was more important than Philip Guston. Ed Ruscha, Ed Ruscha and John Baldessari knew each other quite well. And I think that probably the thing that we get from Ed Ruscha in terms of how much of an influence he is on postmodern art is this kind of like this process and typology type approach of, like, in terms of these photographic books especially. Saul LeWitt, by really kind of emphasizing the idea that art could be turned into just a concept without a physical object to it whatsoever. So these installations, if you may not remember from the last time I talked about Saul LeWitt, but these are where he doesn't make the drawings in the space. Instead, he creates a series of instructions. Sometimes they're very long, like 50-page instructions on how to make these drawings, and then he mails them to the gallery, and then the gallery or the museum space constructs them for him. And usually with these, he makes them himself first in his studio and then destroys it and keeps only the instructions. It's very much like, almost, instead of like making a work of art, it's like making a computer program that makes the work of art. So that the list of instructions, how the thing becomes the art. And so part of his idea is that the concept, the way the actual instructions are more important than the thing, because the thing can be easily destroyed. So this is that was my 1-minute warning. So I will get back to you in part 3. We'll take up talking about Terry Winters and system art. All right.